What is going on, Neon Nation? Welcome back for yet another dose of Cyberpunk 2077 news. First up, we have a couple new screenshots correlating to some of the footage CDPR has recently shown off, including this shot of the industrial zone in Night City, detached from the swirling neon glitz of more central locations, as well as some of the oil fields. Lead quest designer Pavel Sasko has hinted that he has designed some content for this location, and we do see Johnny walk in this area with the Petrochem logo in the background, meaning that yes, there will be quests on the very fringes of the city in more quiet locations. Finally, we have a scene from the Nomad life path as you're speeding towards the border to enter Night City. Again, all of these locations have popped up in the most recent footage shown at the 5th episode of The Wire. Now shout out to the Cyberpunk 2077 countdown page, who also got a retweet, and yes, we are down to 9 days till the game releases. Speaking of 9 days, check out this Reddit post showing off massive amounts of printed Cyberpunk 2077 discs on both the Xbox and PlayStation. I know for those of you who've been waiting years and years, this is some serious eye candy. Also check out this custom Cyberpunk 2077 RTX 3080, which will be given away on the Chinese social platform Bilibili. If you guys remember, CDPR teamed up with Nvidia to release a limited quantity of RTX 2080 Ti's, and now we have the 3080, since technology has taken a step forward since the game has been delayed multiple times. Not really the most outlandish design here, but hey, it's a custom 3080 to run Cyberpunk 2077 at some seriously high frame rates and resolutions, so I doubt anyone who's winning this is going to be complaining. Before we get into some of the bigger news topics, we also have the inevitability of the first adult Cyberpunk 2077 parody film out there in the universe. Not really sure this was needed, but for those of you who are frantically typing this into your URL as I'm saying this, you might want to go ahead and plug in your Oculus at the same time, since this does have VR and 8K support. Moving on, we have a stream with Alana Pierce, Tom Marks, and Phil Hornshaw discussing the 16-hour previews that Big Games Media had the chance to go hands-on with last week. Hornshaw and Marks both got a 16-hour preview spanning 2 days, and we have talked about their impressions before, but we do go into more detail here. When it comes to things that they loved about the game, Phil and Tom both mentioned the city as huge and expansive, and like nothing that they've seen before when it comes to a concrete jungle open world. Hornshaw likened it to Deus Ex, but with a deeper and broader story, and Marks made mention that the scope of the game location is like nothing he's seen before. Both journalists also did address a concern about crowds, mentioning that there was a pretty dense NPC population, and in the case of Hornshaw, he felt like he was elbowing people out of the way at times, and that it was hard to make his way through mass gatherings. When it comes to their absolute favorite things, Tom made mention that the main story really sank its hooks into him, whereas Phil mentioned that the characters stood out the most, with conversations and the ability to build rapport as being a high point. Gameplay wise, this is also not a run and gun style shooter, and you need to be more deliberate in your actions, especially early game when enemies are more bullet spongy and inflict more damage to the player. Both weren't overly fond of swordplay, and bare knuckle boxing had a little nuance to it, but it was just okay in their eyes. AI seems to be okay, and if you're progressing over multiple floors of a mega building for example, the engagement seemed to reset. For example, if you went guns blazing on floor 1 and wiped everyone out, going up to floor 2, those enemies wouldn't be aware of what happened below, and you can choose to approach this battle a little differently. Minigames they mentioned included a shooting drill with a reward at the end, as well as potential midway games, which we might have caught a glimpse of in the official trailer. We already know that there's hacking, street racing, as well as something on par with the scope of Gwent, so it's nice to see even more minigames be brought up. Braindance was mentioned in a positive light and seemed to have a nice story component and a change of pace attached to them. Speaking of rewards, Marks got a very interesting reward from shacking up with a working woman in the form of an adult toy melee weapon. Now obviously, if you have played Saints Row or GTA, this is likely on par with that, and is probably some much needed comedic relief in a future with a ton of dark motifs and themes. Marks mentions that more than any other game he's played, there is sex and violence absolutely everywhere. He also mentions that the Corpo life path seemed to offer more aggressive dialogue options, and he found himself berating an employee of a hotel at one point. Small spoiler warning for this next bit, and I will put a timestamp on screen for those who want to skip it. I'm giving you guys 2 seconds to pause before we move forward. Both Marks and Hornshaw spoke on specific quests, with Hornshaw mentioning the investigation into the murder of the mayor of Night City. This is most likely Lucius Ryan, who is integral in the Unification War and essentially summoned Arasaka back to Night City. Marks also claims that one of the more touching moments was going to a friend's funeral. I think we probably know who he's referring to at this point, and the foreshadowing we've seen so far in various trailers, as well as an explicit death screen here, might mean that this is an inevitability. Moving on, we have a new interview with Mike Pondsmith by EC1, where he details some of his impressions of Cyberpunk, his role in being an advisor, and the origins of developing the Cyberpunk IP. When asked what his first impression of 2077 is, Pondsmith mentions that he actually hasn't seen the game in total. In game development, it's fairly common to see chunks and pieces at a certain stage, which do come together in the very end, but because he can't travel to Poland, he hasn't seen the final product. And a question about if the future has to be dark, Mike mentions that Cyberpunk V3 was a divergent timeline which was more positive, and pivoted mainly on transhumanistic elements of a technologically robust future. It didn't sell as well, mainly due to the fact that true cyberpunk, filled with cool jackets, bulky weaponry, and mean streets, is more of a fairy tale that you can get immersed into. Transhumanism is close enough to reach modern day where it isn't in that realm of fantasy per se. Mike also mentions that when he first started, he actually set out to do a game on Blade Runner, which was one of his most favorite movies before he stumbled upon Hardwired and fell in love with it. After that, he decided to create a more expansive cyberpunk game called Cyberpunk 2013. An interesting little fact here is that this was finished before Pondsmith even discovered William Gibson. Streets of Fire was also mentioned and heavily influenced the idea of fixers, rocker boys, and nomads. When it comes to what else Pondsmith is getting up to in the future, he says he's going to keep trucking ahead with Cyberpunk, and that he assumes CDPR is going to do the same. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Lore Part 2 will be out this week, and for more Cyberpunk, join Neon Nation by subscribing to the Neon Arcade.